Hello, Sathnam Sanghera.
Hello, it's nice to be here, I think. Although I feel like I'm betraying my therapist because I normally see my therapist on a Tuesday morning, and here we are.
Yes, you're being unfaithful.
I had to cancel his session, yeah.
I'm very honoured that you cancelled your session to have the session with me. But also, you had a difficult journey to get here.
Yeah, I lost my phone for the second time in a fortnight. I find that people sympathize with that because phones contain your entire life.
Your entire life?
Yeah, and it took me days to just transfer everything. So here we are. But I'm trying to be zen about it.
Trying to be zen when you feel like you've lost your life on a tube in Shepherd's Bush.
Yeah, I mean, it's just a thing, isn't it? It's just a thing.
So I have been really curious and trying to find out about you from what you've written and what you've spoken about, and kind of recognise that you're a British journalist, you're a best-selling author, and that now we're going to be talking kind of psychologically about your life. And I was thinking about whenever I first meet a client in particular, I look at our history and where we come from. And given what you've written about and your history, our histories are very different. And yet we meet together in this room. And it's, I guess, one of the things I'm really curious about is how that connects with each other and where it can disconnect and where I can not understand you or make assumptions about you that I imagine you navigate on a regular basis.
Yeah. I guess the normal therapist situation is that you often don't know much about the other person, but I do know some things about you. I think I had therapy with my current therapist for around 5 years before I knew anything about him. I didn't know he was gay, didn't know he was married, and I just asked him one day. And I was really struck by how little he had conveyed. And actually, I realized then how important actually is in therapy to actually not know much about the person you're talking to. But this is a different situation.
This is a different situation. And yeah, it's another whole thing when you know stuff about your therapist because you put stuff onto them. And that's another whole conversation. I talk with my supervisors about my clients, about the fact that I have a sort of public face. But the first question I ask all my guests is, what is a particular challenge you are facing or you have faced?
I should know this because I've listened to 4 of your podcasts and I haven't thought of it. A particular challenge I have faced is to be honest with my family, I guess, and
That's
myself.
a big thing.
Isn't that the biggest challenge of life?
Yeah.
To be true to yourself. Although what the self is a changing thing.
Can you say a bit more about the challenge of being honest with your parents? So, I mean, the history of your parents is that they came from India, they're Punjabi Sikhs, and they came here in the mid-60s?
Yeah, I mean, it's in a way, my story is very specific in that my parents, Punjabi immigrants, didn't then speak much English, then weren't hugely integrated into British society. My father had schizophrenia, my sister had schizophrenia. It's a very specific story, but I find that actually it's such a common story. I think it's universal in that your families have ideas and expectations of you, which you often struggle to fulfill. And I think that is I think almost everyone has a version of that in their lives. And weirdly, it's really easy. It's relatively easy to be honest to strangers and even to someone like you. It's really hard to be honest to the people we love and know the most, which is weird. It's a complete paradox, isn't it? It should be easy to reveal ourselves to the people we see the most.
What do you think it is about being honest with them that's so hard?
It's difficult just because talking to families is difficult, but also I guess I've ended up having a very different life to theirs, like completely different. My mum had a couple of years of education, so she can read and write in Punjabi, and now can read and write a bit in English and can speak a bit of English. My dad had no education at all, none. only worked for a couple of years of his life before he got very sick. All of my siblings were married by 21. None of them had gone
Arranged marriages.
2 sisters arranged marriage. My brother fell in love with someone who was luckily of the same background. Almost everyone in my extended family doing a working class job. No one had gone to university. No one in my whole family, extended family, had gone to Oxbridge. So I then went to a grammar school and went to Cambridge and joined the media and became a writer. All these things just beyond the experience of my family.
And so the bridging of that, where you kind of stand between two worlds, where you're brown in a predominantly white world, and then in their world, you're, I don't know what, over-educated, living in a completely different, kind of living a middle-class life, not a working-class life. Is that right?
Yeah,
not quite sure the
there's
words.
so many levels on which it's challenging. First of all, the racial thing, I guess. I'm living in quite a white world. I have been since grammar school. The class thing is huge. Like, there were no books in my house. Like, no books. The first book I owned, I won at school for a voucher.
That's so touching. Makes me cry.
There were no newspapers. But also it's cultural as well. It's class. It's race. It's everything. It's absolutely everything.
But the thing I'm trying to get my head around is within all of those differences, the prisms that in some ways separate you from your family. What's difficult about being honest is because you don't think they'll understand you, or you think you'll disappoint them, or that you'll upset them in some way. Because normally we aren't honest because we either want to protect ourselves from being hurt, or mainly because we want to protect ourselves from being hurt, or the other person.
Yeah, this is quite difficult to talk about because in a way it's in the past sense, because I did have it out with them
Right.
in the form of a memoir and an ongoing process.
The Boy with the Top Knot.
Yeah. And
it's a great book, by the way.
Oh, thanks. Well, I wrote it's quite a long time ago and it kind of worked. And so now I think they pretty much know most things about my life. So in a way, I have to put myself back into my shoes when I was 30. And then it was quite formal expectations they had of me, in that they wanted me to marry someone, not just Sikh, like the rest of my family had done, but of a particular caste. I guess I grew up with the idea as a son I would look after my parents. So there's a geographical thing of me living in London and them living in Wolverhampton. And yeah, they just wanted very specific things of me. And I did none of them, basically.
So you felt in some way that you failed them or were failing them whilst you were in a way living the dream that you wanted?
Yeah, I felt massive guilt. Huge, crippling guilt. And also homesickness, weirdly, even though when I wasn't far away in London or Cambridge, I could feel homesick quite easily. And a constant push and pull. And living a dual life. Again, I mean, I was listening to the interview you did with my friend Mohsin Zaidi, and
he had the same.
But I think it's not even the fact that we're both brown. I think a lot of gay people have this when their families don't want them to be gay. I think it's the oldest story in the world when it comes to expectations
from parents
it's like
to children.
Totally, it's what Jane Austen is largely about, isn't it?
Yeah.
Social expectations and marital expectations.
And the thing when I was thinking with you and kind of challenges, and this relates to, in some ways, the most personal is also the most universal, which is exactly what you're saying, is the negotiation about identity and belonging and race is very complex. And if you put into that what I assume is quite a lot of collective transgenerational trauma because of empire, because of the partition in India, 350 years of empire, there's a lot that's being passed down that we're not even aware of, that's kind of in our systems. And I imagine there's some of that between you and me in the moment, as it were.
I don't see you as a symbol of the British Empire, so you can chill.
Good.
But yeah, I mean, thing is, I became so at ease at navigating the middle classes and even the upper middle classes that on a fundamental level, I'm at ease here. But that in itself, I think, became a problem. How much I was at ease with it, in that I think I ran away from my family and was helped with my education, and in my day-to-day life acted like those problems weren't there, like those challenges weren't there. I'd There was a massive dissonance, a total disconnect between my two lives, and I would control things in such a crazy way. I mean, I even had a flat. I was living with my girlfriend, but I had another flat just in case my parents visited.
Because you didn't want them to know you were living with a girlfriend.
Yeah.
Because they'd disapprove. Yeah.
And I sublet that flat out to my friend John Oliver in Herne Hill and my friend Ollie. And if my parents ever came up, I'd put up pictures of Guru Nanak and pretend I lived there.
Gosh.
But occasionally there'd be cross wires, and I'd dread my mum ringing, just like a phone call.
Like thinking, catching you out.
I'd worry that I'd been found out. And sometimes I had been found out. Now I look back on it, I now realize that is when she didn't call was often when I was at most risk, because she was in a depression about it.
Because she had a sense that you weren't living the life that she expected you to live. Well, also you were in London, like you were distant from her.
And actually sometimes I was living abroad, and I only found afterwards, like once when I was at university, I had a friend of mine who was a voice actress, and she did an answer machine message for me. And my mum rang and thought, oh my God, that's his white girlfriend, and went into a deep despond. But I didn't hear from her. I only heard about it afterwards. And there was another time when a relative rang her and said they'd seen me with my white girlfriend and kind of grasped me up. And again, I think she went silent then. But it's all very weird now talking about it, because
it's past.
It has actually passed. And the amazing thing is, I mean, last Christmas, my nephews and nieces, we all gathered together, and each one of them was going out with someone who wasn't Sikh.
Wow.
And including me.
It's more common in the next generation down, isn't it?
It was really amazing to see it and note it. And I think it takes one person to be honest in a family, and then it's contagious. It's a bit like when one couple divorces in a friendship group and suddenly everyone starts divorcing. It becomes acceptable. And I was looking around and I was thinking, this is great. But also, I felt a bit annoyed that they were having this.
Because it was so easy.
Everything's so easy for them. They just introduce their white Hindu Muslim boyfriend, girlfriend to my grandmother. My grandmother loves them. It's really hard for me. Really hard. And it occasionally makes me angry. But also my mum is full of remorse about it. She's come such a long way. She really beats herself up about it. And she blames herself for the fact that I'm 48 and unmarried. She now looks back and thinks, I shouldn't have made it so hard for him. Maybe he'd have kids. I don't feel like that. But she beats herself up about it. There's a lot there.
There's a lot there. I mean, what I'm aware of as you're speaking is how much insight you have into yourself. Because, I mean, a lot of what you do, isn't it, is kind of looking externally and then going internally and making sense of it for yourself. So you have a lot of kind of understanding of yourself, but also being aware that you feel angry that your nieces and nephews have the kind of simplicity of life that you had longed for, comes from a place that it's sort of like hurt in a way, that you were hurt by those years of hiding. And it sounds like your mum also was hurt from those places of you hiding. But now that you have an understanding, it's not like you get over it, is it? Like, it's still part of you, it's still part of her.
So, yeah, and it's still complicated. It's not. Thing is, when you write a memoir and it gets adapted for TV,
it's happy ever after type
happy
thing.
ever, and you give a neat version of events, which you almost start believing, but it's not neat. And it goes on in weird ways. I mean, one way it goes on is that, I'm now been in a long-term relationship with someone who's not Sikh, about 3 or 4 years. I get no grief from anyone. People just generally want me to be happy with her. But my nieces going out with people who aren't Sikh get members of the extended family ringing my mum saying, oh, they shouldn't be going out with that kind of man.
It's a betrayal in some way.
Because there's misogyny. It's okay for a man to do it, but for a woman to do it is different. And it's also, my mum has changed, but the extended family, they're still on their journey, and if it is a journey, but also I don't care what they think. I think some of my anger and her anger is that the social pressures that she was under and I was under and continue to be. And it's amazing to see her stand up to that now. She's very defiant.
Good for her.
Yeah.
Good for her. She's got a lot of courage, your mum, hasn't she?
I've been on a wild journey, but she's been on a incredible journey as this girl married off to someone she didn't know at the age of 15 or 16, sent to a country where she had no relatives. He then has paranoid schizophrenia.
But she wouldn't have a clue what it was.
She had no idea what it was. She's then blamed for that illness by the extended family.
Like she's a witch.
Yep. Which is a very common attitude in Asian communities. She then has 4 kids, raises them. He then never works. She provides for them in every possible way. And, she's been brought up with these values. The kids then challenge her in those values. And she comes along with us. I mean, what a journey she has had.
Incredible woman.
Yeah, it's incredible. She's also very, very irritating.
Yes.
And I feel
I mean, like all mothers, whoever child you are, your mothers are annoying. So
she can't stop interfering and she can't stop cooking. It's like a
addiction,
neurosis. She just cannot stop feeding us. And
it's her way of loving you now.
Yeah, obviously, but yeah.
It's really annoying.
It's still annoying. She's still our mother. But yeah, she's come an incredible way. And also I look at her relationship with my dad. I cannot even begin to imagine what that was like. They've been through so much.
How is he now, your dad?
No, my dad is, very unwell in the sense that officially he's got schizophrenia and dementia.
Oh, whoa.
But he's okay in the sense that my mum looks after him and he's very, very stable. And it's the most unusual love story because the way my mum talks about him, it's very loving. She's always telling us stories about silly things he's done or said. And she has dedicated herself to him for 50 years, right?
Wow.
I don't think...
The loyalty,
I don't know anyone who could do that.
No.
Yeah.
With not much reward.
No. I think her faith gets her through a lot of it, but I think she wouldn't have had it any other way.
And your sister has schizophrenia too. And the thing that I really want to acknowledge is that schizophrenia, as opposed to having a low mood or being a bit anxious, is a very serious mental illness that requires medication, requires a lot of commitment just to get up every day and stay sane enough to have a day.
Yeah, I mean, people with schizophrenia, I mean, this is generalizing, but generally, these are people you cross the street to avoid because sometimes the symptoms are very concerning and worrying. A lot of people have schizophrenia, end up in prison, homeless, frankly dead.
Yeah, they have very early life expectancy, don't they?
Very low life expectancy. Yeah, and it's very hard, very painful to tally that image with my sister and my father. But there have been times where I've been disturbed by their symptoms. And there is no cure. And it's very different to depression and anxiety. And actually, I've written about this, about how the increase in mental health awareness is great. But actually, what it means in practice is that people with severe mental illnesses get even less attention and even fewer resources. So in a way, awareness hasn't really helped.
People are really seriously ill.
No. And people still terrified of worrying, symptoms of severe mental illness. Everyone is very understanding on an Instagram post about anxiety, but it's different when it's someone in the street screaming at you, or hearing voices, or having hallucinations. That's a very difficult thing to deal with.
Yeah. And the fear that invokes brings a lot of the stigma, doesn't it? Whereas we can kind of sit alongside someone who's depressed or anxious, but someone who's acting out in a way that frightens them because they are so frightened, but is also contagious. We turn away and we don't want to look at it.
Yeah, and I did that. And sometimes there's violence. I mean, this is a really awkward thing to think about because, the commonly said thing is that there's no link between mental illness and violence. But sometimes severely mentally ill people are violent.
Well, they don't have impulse control, do they?
And, quite a lot of them end up in prison for doing crimes. And that is really, really awkward and depressing. And yeah.
Yeah. And not the place for someone with schizophrenia to be. I mean,
No.
So if someone is listening who recognizes themselves in you for different reasons, it may be for the same kind of background from a different background, what was it eventually that enabled you to kind of dare to tell the truth to your parents, which shifted your relationship with yourself and your relationship with them?
I had enough of the lies. It was just really unsustainable. Like the lies, it's getting too elaborate. And
they kill you a little bit. Every lie kills a little bit in you.
And I think I was just I'd had quite a few relationships and they hadn't really gone any. They kept on failing for reasons I couldn't really understand. And I felt like the lying was part of it, and.
Which is what your mum still thinks.
Yeah. I don't know if it was actually. I think maybe I was just avoidant. And yeah, I had this opportunity to kind of write about it. And the one thing that had always worked out in my life has been writing. I think I had faith in it. I think on some level also, I think I knew my mum loved me. And I think I saw that. I mean, I generally
trusted it enough.
I didn't consciously. I thought she might disown me and I took preparations and all of that. But I think fundamentally I knew she wouldn't. I knew she loved me too much. And I thought, you know what, on some level, I thought I could win this argument. And yeah, it kind of worked out. Although it's a narrative, isn't it?
And so it was a possibility. And for people listening, they could be exiled from their family for being gay, for changing their religion, for being trans, for being many different things. And underneath that, I think the fundamental need of us all is to be loved and to belong. And in some way, you're saying, as much as you threatened her sense of belonging, of what was okay in her family, where the requirement to belong, the love, you trusted enough that the love she felt for you would overcome the fear of not belonging. And I think in some families listening, that isn't the case because the fear overwhelms the love.
Yeah, and I get a lot of people writing to me asking for advice in very similar situations. They might be gay, they might be Sikh and they want to marry someone who's not Sikh. They might be Catholic and want to marry a Protestant, whatever. And they often say, oh, I've read your book. Have you got any advice for me? Because I'm going to tell my parents. And I always say, I'm afraid to say, there's no predicting how your parents are going to react. People and families are all different. And they might disown you. Even in my family, extended family, I've got people who've been fundamentally disowned for who they are. And so it's always possible.
Mum didn't speak to him for a year, wasn't it?
Yeah. Yeah, and I think in general, in Asian communities, it's harder for women than for men. In a way, men are accepted more than women, but anything's possible. And so you've got to do it not because you think they're going to accept you. You've got to do it because it's the right thing to do for yourself and to have your support mechanisms in place in case it all goes wrong.
And from what you're saying, for you, your therapy, I know you're seeing a therapist, is your writing. Your writing is your friend, finding the words, finding the narrative for what is chaotic, for what is confusing, that makes no sense of. That's how you settle yourself?
Yeah, I was thinking this on my way here, and that, I mean, I've been writing from a very young age, from around 16. I was writing for my local newspaper. And what is it that drives me? I think that if you're the child of immigrants with schizophrenia, you are the lowest of you do not exist. If you're a child of an illiterate man,
Who don't
unemployed,
speak English in
yeah,
Wolverhampton.
yeah, you really don't exist in the eyes of society. And I think writing
Just
for
pause
me,
that. I mean, that in itself is just so shocking that you don't exist because of that.
yeah,
It's like you're not human, like you're not of any value.
yeah. And I think about my childhood, and I don't do that very often, actually, because I think I did too much of it. But I was working in a factory for up to 90 hours a week as illegally for 50p an hour.
For
And
7 years you did
that is the underclass. It's not even working class. And so I really did not exist. And for me, writing did something incredible. And I just remember even like writing for the local newspaper and coming into school and teachers having read it and just looking at me differently. And I was like, well, I actually exist. And for me, writing has always been actualization. And yeah, creating
It's very
something.
moving, that.
But you create something that is more uncertain in real life than it is on the page.
Say more about that.
Well, you create narratives, don't you? You create myths. The big narrative I created with my memoir was I really wanted to marry someone I love and to be free to do that. But then I haven't. And I think there was a whole load of other work which was separate to that, which is that I didn't know how to have a relationship. And that was completely disconnected. Well, not completely, but somewhat disconnected to the dilemmas in the book. That was just regular stuff. How do you have a relationship when you're an introvert, when you're avoidant, and all of that stuff?
But also, how do you have a relationship, even if you have a tendency to be an introvert, when you haven't seen modeled a kind of very healthy relationship? You saw a relationship where your mum took care of your dad. You haven't seen a relationship where it's relational, where it's equal. And also, if you come from a perception, your first perception of yourself is that you don't exist, that you are kind of the underclass of the underclass almost. How do you have the trust in your own value to be worthy of love?
Yeah, I think that's something I learned through therapy, that I didn't have great models. Although there was a lot of love there, it was very dysfunctional. And yeah, almost all the relationships I had as models in my life created this idea that relationships were obligation,
Duty, which of course you'd want to turn away from. It's like,
and not something that would give me something that would enhance my life. And
that they'd be like prisons.
yeah, and I guess took me 15, 20 years to realize this, but I've always found it very easy to end relationships and then often end them and then regret it sometime afterwards. But I've always found it very easy to end things because for me, it's the end of obligation.
It's a release.
It's a release. And no matter how hard that ending a relationship is, I could sit there for hours, how torturous it is watching someone cry or cry myself, and the next day feel like it was Christmas Day. I just felt so
Exaltation.
great to be free again. And it has been my current relationship where I've finally broken that pattern, I think.
Good for you.
Yeah.
How did you break it?
I think we have opposite attachment styles. She's quite anxious and I'm avoidant. And in a way, she just didn't let me run away.
Good for her.
Yeah. I've learned how to have an argument.
Rather than cut and run.
And sit with it, sit with the feeling and the discomfort. And the realization that even though running away would feel great, it would feel awful a month later. But all the stuff you talk about in your videos.
Yes. Yeah. It's hard sitting with it.
It's really hard sitting with it. It's really hard. But I'm glad I've managed to do it.
I'm really glad you have too.
But you just exchange one set of problems for another set of problems, don't you? I mean, you're never cured.
Can I just notice that I said I'm really glad too, and you let that sit for like a nanosecond before you went to what else is difficult?
Yeah.
Like it's hard to let yourself stay with what's good.
Yeah, that's something else I can't do, really. Yeah, but I think that it's not entirely negative in that it drives me in my work, I think. I don't want to sit around dwelling on the positive.
But that has a straight line back to your roots, right? It's hard to trust that you can settle in the positive and be safe when you come from a background where you don't exist. Because you can be annihilated if you don't matter.
Yeah. Although I didn't grow up feeling like I didn't matter, in that I felt hugely loved within the context of my family. And that's what I guess made it so scary that I might lose it. But I felt, in many ways, I feel like, despite everything we've just said, I feel like I had an idyllic childhood, in that I had lots of people to play with. I was left alone a lot. And I do think leaving kids alone is a good thing.
Yeah.
And I was adored by my mum. And
that's in you.
Yeah, but also that can be too much.
Yes.
And you can be adored too much. And I think I spent a lot of my 20s just traveling and just trying to create distance, even though I never enjoyed the traveling.
And you felt homesick?
I felt so homesick. And these are the days before the internet. You remember writing postcards and really expensive reverse charge phone calls?
Yes.
And I would spend like a whole summer in New York doing a job in a school and feeling so homesick.
I think what's really interesting about needing to get away and needing space and at the same time being incredibly homesick and not very happy is how two things can be true at the same time. And that in some way is the template of you, isn't it? That there are lots of, and maybe all of us, certainly me, colliding pulls and pushes that we try and kind of smooth out and make one fit, but actually they just have to live in us in a contradictory, quite confusing, infuriating way.
Yeah, I mean, I think that's the one thing I've learned about life, is that opposite things can be true at the same time. And it's definitely true of people. I think whatever you say about anyone, the opposite is true to some degree. And I see it myself. I mean, I do this very kind of extroverted job, I guess, but I'm a introvert and I can't stand any kind of attention. It was my birthday 2 days ago. I couldn't even stand the attention of having to blow the candles out in front of my family. And my girlfriend's the same as that. Same, she's a journalist. She's on TV a lot. Can't stand any kind of attention. But
a Jungian would say that what you hate most is what you long for most.
Maybe, yeah, absolutely. But I felt it profoundly at university, where I was so excited to be there, but at the same time just crushed by homesickness and guilt.
And now with the attention and the films made about you, the documentary you did, Empire Land, you get a lot of attention and you're still writing and finding your voice, that you want people to read. How does that tension?
Yeah, I cannot, like you've observed in this session, I can't sit in the place of compliments and praise very long. I feel like it's kind of death. I feel like Yeah, I feel like, when at the beginning of a talk, when someone introduces you and they're reading out your CV, your LinkedIn entry,
Yeah.
to me, it sounds like an obituary. To me, it sounds like this is what you've done. It's all over now.
R.I.P.
Yeah, it's like it's done. It's the past. For me, the journey is everything, and the next thing is the thing. The writing is the thing. The journey is everything, and I've learned a bit how to enjoy certain moments, like when the film came out of Top Knot. I remember telling myself, "Look, this is not going to happen again. Try to enjoy it,"
Well done.
as I did.
Did you enjoy it?
I did, yeah.
It's a great movie. I love that movie.
But other things like when I'm a bestseller or anything, if I really have learned to take time out and enjoy those things, but it doesn't come naturally to me.
Well, the cognitive reason is the process and the writing is what matters. The present and the future is what matters. But there's also something about not being able to dare to open yourself up to probably what you really want.
Yeah, I mean, ultimately, all of this is all about fear of death, isn't it?
Yes.
Isn't it? That's what therapy is all about, isn't it? Ultimately, it's about coming to terms with the fact that it's all going to be over soon. Well, at some point. Yeah. It's a cheerful note, isn't it? We can't end on that note, though.
Okay. So what is the present and the future that, as a way to end, that you're excited about?
Well, it's good to be in a relationship. And
tell me more about the relationship. What do you want for the relationship?
Well, it's functional. We're living together and it's all, it feels very grown up and
Committed.
Something I've not really done before.
So you've never lived with someone before?
Not for this amount of time. I mean, we're like 4 years into it. As also like dealing with expectations, like my family's expectations are no longer a problem, but I think I've created expectations of people, because when you write a book, talking about your love life, I think people want an ending. So I get asked a lot, and I guess I'm being very careful about what I'm saying, because there's a certain amount of prurience, and I need to learn how to not care about that. I've not really learned how to navigate it. I'm the weirdest thing, because I would say that you'll never find anyone more private than someone who's written a memoir. Because
the contradiction.
You learn the value of privacy, and in a way I feel like I overshared. And ever since I've been trying to make up for it.
Get it back.
Trying to have a load of experiences that the world doesn't know about and keep them private. Possibly for no reason than just to say they're private,
They're mine.
Yeah. And it's really important to have that. And I feel like the memoir was a young person's book. I would never, ever, ever write anything like that again. There's only something someone can do if they hadn't written a book before and they didn't know what they're doing. But now I know what happens. And so I feel very different about information.
I mean, I think that's a really important place to stop, in the sense that your kind of internal private world and what precious experiences you have, which are both difficult experiences and positive experiences, you need to keep within yourself, with the intimacy within yourself. Somehow it feels like you felt you watered something away, that you kind of gave something away that's precious of yours, that got diluted is a better way of saying it, through the memoir, that you kind of wish you could get that back.
Yeah. But also I'm very glad that I did it with the permission of my family, and they asked for certain things to be taken out, which I hated at the time because it meant whole chapters being deleted. But I'm so glad that happened now, because now
those bits
no one knows about. And yeah, it's good to share, but it's also good to not share.
Yeah. Well, on that point, Sathnam, thank you for both sharing and holding in what you need to preserve for yourself.
Thank you. Thanks for your excellent questions.
We are going to talk about my very moving and kind of illuminating conversation with Sathnam Sanghera. And just say my main thought after it was I just had so many more things I wanted to find out from him and talk to him about. It felt like it was the beginning of a conversation that I wanted to go on for much longer. But I wondered what your responses were.
Yes, I mean, sort of similarly, it felt like it was a very rich conversation, and I had lots and lots of different notes, and now I'm staring at all my notes, just trying to decide which note to talk about first while my daughter screams in the background. But I actually think the conversation that, even though we're a Therapy Works podcast, and obviously we talk about therapy, we talk about mental illness a lot, we haven't actually talked that much about really serious mental illness. No. And so I think I felt very grateful for him for bringing that up, and the sort of difficulty of that, the sort of taboo nature of really serious mental illness that people shy away from. And I think it's a little bit like people not wanting to talk about death. There's this sort of feeling of almost like a magical thinking of that it could be contagious. Like that if I go near it, if I approach it as a topic, it's like somehow I might catch it. And also a sort of fear, I think, when you see somebody who's really seriously mentally ill and talking to themselves or showing behaviors that are sort of outside of the realms of what we would consider mentally well.
Seem disturbing from our frame of reference.
Yes. And when we're afraid, we move away. And so I really appreciated him bringing that into the light in a way of that this is a difficult thing that people don't talk about. And I have been reading and watching a lot of Dan Siegel at the moment. And he talks about, I think this is a really useful frame because I think it encompasses everybody, which really is that all mental wellness or mental illness can be categorized within a framework of thinking about excess rigidity on one side and excess chaos on the other side. And if you think about it as a river, and you've got rigidity on one side and chaos on the other side, and where you want to be is in the middle. And the wider your banks are, the more mentally well you are, because the less rigid you are, the less chaotic you are. And actually, some mental illnesses are both. You can have excess rigidity and excess chaos at the same time, which I think lots of actually more serious mental illnesses are.
That's brilliant. I've never heard that.
Yes,
I love it.
It's sort of, it's very, like it puts everybody in the river.
Yes.
And where you are is just sort of where your banks are. And therefore also where your kind of growing edge is also sort of knowing, and this is sort of more general, not specific for people who have more serious mental illness, is like, actually, am I somebody who is more on the rigid side, and my sort of growing edge is therefore to get a bit more towards the chaos side, like be a bit more flexible, be a bit more open? Or is my sort of growing edge that actually I'm on the chaos side of the bank, and I need to find ways of having more structure in my life just to sort of widen those banks between rigidity and chaos?
To bring me a bit more back into the middle. Like,
yeah, exactly.
But also it's interesting to think of those things in terms of the networks and systems and families we're in, isn't it? Because my first thought was thinking about the three of us and like, who's closer to the rigid side and who's closer to chaos? And thinking like, well, mum's nearer rigid and I'm nearer chaos. Like, we're like those two. And there's a reason for those things to some extent as well, that those things, although they're internal, they're also relational and dynamic, aren't they? That, I don't know, I feel like most people must know the experience of going to the airport, and if you're the most anxious person in the room, then you get very controlling about the flight. But if there's someone who's like way more anxious than you, then you're like, they've got the anxiety, I can just kick back. And I think it's also nice to think of those things as we can also be different versions of ourselves with different people according to how rigid or chaotic they are, or how we feel we are in relation to them.
Because like when you were on your gap year, so if you were the team leader who's in charge of everything, but when you're with us, you're not.
And they go with the flow lady.
You'll go with the flow lady who's like looking at us, like raising our eyebrows because we're being so controlling.
You know, I've met people in my life who are like, they enjoy the experience of being like the last person onto the airplane. And I'm like,
I cannot understand that. I mean, basically all of us, for example, at the beginning of almost every podcast, Mum goes, because we all turn up pretty much to the minute at the point that we all agree to arrive.
It's a little blessing.
And Mum goes, we're all so punctual.
Yes. I actually take it as a little blessing. It feels like a little prayer is answered.
Yes, but then we're also a bit like, we're also on the side of rigid, right? Because if one of us is 1 minute late, immediately there's a WhatsApp being like, are you on your way?
Yes.
Are you coming?
So my little bit more chaos is like, it's a relative. It's a relative chaos.
It's very relative. Yeah.
Okay, can we get back to Sathnam?
Sorry.
Sorry.
Sathnam. Yeah.
I was sidetracked.
It made me also think a bit of the David Harewood episode we did, of where he gave us such a helpful insight into psychosis and being the person with that lived experience. And that although that's not Sathnam's direct experience, understanding him in the context of his family, I think we often think of people who with serious mental illness somehow very solitary, without context and family and love and relationship. And actually we can hear in Sathnam's story the kind of the context in which his dad and his sister and himself and his mum all lived in the UK. And I actually didn't know, and maybe other people did, about the taboo around violence and schizophrenia. And I went online to have a look. It's like, I feel like what I was told is that people with schizophrenia were no more likely to be violent than other people. And actually, statistically, interesting that that's not true, that there is a reality to that. Although there's a website link. If people are interested, we can put it on at the end, because I thought it was a really lovely unpicking of the data around that. I think the story behind data is often really important, because you can just take that headline, they are more violent, and be quite simplistic about the whole thing. But a lot of the violence is actually driven because people self-medicate when they're schizophrenic to regulate, and actually it's the combination of schizophrenia and drugs that really is the bigger risk factor for violence. And also that often, because the onset is in the teenage years, that actually is an age in which young men are their most violent and risky behaviours anyway. So is it a product of the age at which schizophrenia sets on, and therefore they're in a risky category anyway? And I just think it's useful to unpick these kind of headlines.
What's the website called?
It's called Living with Schizophrenia. And there's a particular sort of information sheet about schizophrenia and dangerous behaviour.
That's great.
I imagine it's also that it's hard to treat, right? Like it's difficult to find the right balance of medication and support. And
yes, and it said delusions were really the main driver of that behaviour. It's mostly done out of fear.
One of the things I was just left with afterwards, and I've thought about it so much since our conversation, was the description of himself and his family as not existing, as an underclass of underclass. And how and I think his magic, and I wish I'd asked him more about this, was using words. I mean, he was definitely writing and finding language that was a bit like Caitlin Moran, who we interviewed before, but that got him into Cambridge. And then now, as a very successful journalist and author. But that the distance between where he came from and where he is now, and how the impact of that on you psychologically. So the piece I didn't ask him about was he felt guilty because he didn't tell his mum about his more kind of European, less following the sort of his family culture, and was protecting her really from being upset, as well as, I think he was protecting her and scared that she would not speak to him because that is more of a cultural norm. But I was also kind of thinking, imagine all of the network and configuration, and how much he had to erase of his home self in order to be in the Cambridge self or the Times or the FT. And I just can't even fathom what that is psychologically.
I think that makes sense. And I think that what I was really struck by in relation to that was how hard it must be to transmit a belief in yourself when you're living in this sort of non-seen existence. Like the expectations you have of yourself, if you are living in an underclass, it's not what he saw other people around him doing. It's also, not what he saw on TV or on the radio.
There's no models.
There's no models. There was no representation of himself. And yet somehow there was a sort of bridge that he was able to sort of imagine himself crossing in some way. And I don't think I sort of fully understood how that happened.
I thought he spoke very eloquently about how it's both a universal and a deeply personal story. That to some extent, we all have that journey within our own families or cultures of how do we be fully who we are, parts of which our family may understand and approve of, and parts of which may be different to what we think is acceptable. But obviously, there are also ranges in how difficult, how challenging that is, to what extent your family culture is similar to your country's culture that you're in. For him, that was a much harder thing to integrate the different parts of himself that could then be accepted in both spaces, and to what extent they could be accepted in both spaces. You know, it's interesting, Mum, that you emphasize, well, he talks mostly about how could his family accept his Western cultured part and change of class background experiences. But we didn't talk really about how it was for him to be integrated, the sort of Punjabi Sikh part of him in these public spaces that you're talking about. But it was very generous, I suppose, in a way of being, we all have a version of that.
If you're the child that is different in your family, that you are different to everybody else, you feel alienated in your family.
I like the bit where you like sort of thinking about how all mothers are irritating. And I mean, I sometimes annoy myself as a mother. Like, I sort of like almost see myself from the outside. So I'm like, that is
God, you're annoying. Yeah.
God,
no, I do too.
So annoying.
Yeah.
But I suppose the sort of bit that I think is also true is that it's not even always like a negative expectation of a parent, really. I like it could be that you're the not sporty child or the whatever child, but actually it's also like, I think a lot of the expectation or the pressure comes from a place of protection and of love. Like his mum and maybe a little bit you in my not so distant past, like I want you to, be with someone. I want you to be in a relationship. I want you, because that's the version of happiness that you have, and you want that for your child, or you kind of have a belief that this is what will make them happy.
Yeah.
So I think it comes from a place of like, I just want you to be happy, and I think that this is the thing that will make you happy. I mean, it might come from other places too, but I think that is sometimes what happens. But then that still is a pressure.
I think that's a great, so people kind of listening, I was just thinking, when we feel pressured by our parents to perform, to pass exams or be in a relationship or reach particular goals, a different way of framing it and communicating with them is, I know that you want this because you want me to be safe, you want me to be employed, you want me to be happy, you want me to thrive. And I do it very differently to you. You and I have the same intentions and the same kind of goals, but what we're doing and how we're doing it is very different.
In Sathnam's story, there's this story of kind of, as he became more different, the harder it was maybe for his mum to understand that he was going to be okay, which is kind of what you're saying. And I think one thing that you didn't talk that much about in the episode, but seemed very present, was about class. And we don't really talk about class enough as one of those things that can be really hard within a family when a child, becomes middle class, when you grew up in a working class family. I've had several clients who've really struggled with being able to feel that they belong still at home, that their families feel, that their parents can feel like they belong in their world, they can really understand, and feeling fearful that their parents think that they're now better than them, that they like things that make them feel alienated from them, that they do things that feel other. And there's lots of
or the food they want to eat now may be different at home, or things they
even
want to watch on telly.
Even if the agenda of, exactly, that their taste may change or their preferences may change and be different to theirs, and that feels scary. But also that often the beginning of the story is the parents wanting them to pursue going to university, for example, in Sathnam's case, going to Cambridge, but then it has all these unexpected, complicated consequences around identity and class that families don't expect.
It was such a rich conversation, and I actually love what you two have been thinking about too. And we can think that between us more. I think it's something to sort of follow on. And actually, we have a Substack now that you can subscribe to, and maybe doing something about class and difference in families would be a good Substack. So thank you, Sathnam, for coming. He lost his phone, but he found it. Barry found his phone. He went and got it the next day. I know.
I'm so relieved because I felt stressed on his behalf that he'd just
So
gone and
did
U-turned
I.
and then he lost his
It's
sex.
so upsetting. So thanks very much, Sathnam, for being so open, and I learned so much, and I want to do more and learn more, I think. Thank you, everyone, for listening. I hope this is kind of meeting what you're wanting from the podcast. Do rate and review. Let us know what you want more of. If you think this will be helpful for someone else, please share it. And sending you lots of love. Thanks.